Volodya, Ukraine's anti-Russian project is still accurate story that has been quite often repeated by Russian representatives, Russian president, on the national stage, as well as aim to target the Western alliance, trying to confirm that Ukraine is a country that has been created in accordance with the so-called plan to destroy Russian Federation. Let's me remind the article which has been written by Putin on 12th of July 2021. It mentions anti-Russia many times, like this is the quote, step by step, Ukraine was drawn into a dangerous geopolitical game, the goal of which was to turn Ukraine into a barrier between Europe and Russia, into a foothold against Russia. Inevitably, the time has come and the concept of Ukraine is not Russia no longer sufficient. Anti-Russia was needed and we will never put up with this. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Putin labeled the country as anti-Russian project. So, but what is like the origin of this concept? Let's remind that this idea was on Vladimir Putin's historical essay on the historical unity of Russian and Ukrainians, because this text can be regarded at a theoretical justification of Russia's subsequent full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin outlined his worldview in which Ukraine was built up by outsiders as anti-Russian bridgehead. He repeated, labeled pro-Western Ukraine as anti-Russia, negating the country agency and blaming the West for dividing Ukraine and Russia. How many times he has been repeating this? In case if he find the threat towards the Russian Federation, its so-called unity, every time when the country changed its direction, decided not to go further with the Russian Federation, Russian president uses this label like anti-Russian project.
Yeah, so this is an attempt to deprive Ukraine of its own agency, deprive Ukraine of its own culture, to say that Ukraine only exists as a tool of other countries to limit Russia, limit Russian influence as an instrument, right? Objectification, I would say, of Ukrainian story, of Ukrainian history. And I think this is a very important element. It's a kind of a saying that the content of Ukraine, the sense of its existence, is also only negative. There is no positive content of its existence. It's only to deny Russia. That's the idea of Ukraine. That's what Russian propagandists are trying to persuade us. With this narrative, there is another one which is deeply connected and which we might summarize as portraying Ukraine as a puppet of the West. Nastya, what can you tell about this?
Calling Ukraine a puppet of the West is a more generalized way of calling Ukraine. So we can give so many examples of close to these names. So, of course, Russian propaganda calls Ukraine as a puppet of the West or the puppet of the United States of America. They literally say so. They also call Ukraine as a state under the external control, or the state which doesn't have any capacity to be a state. And they use such word combinations and such notions in so many sources. You can find it in different articles, article names, for example, or while journalists or experts say something about Ukraine. And I have several examples. For example, one of the most notorious Russian journalists, Sergei Mardan, he is radio host and author in Radio Komsomolskaya Pravda in Russia. He has also his Telegram channel where he shares his political views, and it's one of the most popular Telegram channels. So in January this year, he told that Ukrainians will bite their teeth into their land so as not to give it to Moscovites. And stories that they are American puppets no longer work. So he tries to deprive Ukraine of its capacity of being a state. And he says that the Ukrainians now doesn't pay attention to the fact that they are so-called American puppets. when they are just trying to hold their land. And there is also one example. This thing was said by Rodion Miroshnik. He is a former ambassador of so-called Luhansk People's Republic to Moscow. And in one of the articles on Russia Today website, he made a comment about Ukraine. It was in December 2022, and he told, Russia does not accept a puppet state that acts as a kamikaze directing its plane in our direction. So he even doesn't mention Ukraine as a puppet. He just says a puppet state that acts against Russia.
I'm interested in what you say, how you quote this Sergei Mardan, because this shows how Russian propaganda is actually changing, right? So they initially started with this idea that Ukraine is a puppet of the West. They, of course, used this idea, and recent comment of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister in India, where even the whole in India was not taking him seriously and laughed at his remarks. You can find a video on this in the internet, including on our Twitter, Ukraine World. So he said that Russia was attacked. Not that Russia has attacked Ukraine, but that Russia was attacked by the West. He meant through Ukraine and with Ukraine, with the help of Ukrainians. So this is the narrative actually which helps Russia to deny its own responsibility for this war, to say that they were dragged into the war, to say that the war is actually defensive one and not offensive one. But interestingly, this quote of Sergei Mardan is actually, shows that Russian propagandists also evolve. And the quote is from his Telegram channel on January 23. So quite a long way to go from the initial invasion. And he says, right, that you already quoted this, that Ukrainians will bite their teeth into the land, so they will really catch, and they are doing actually this. And well, I wonder how this actually reality that shows that Ukrainians are not puppets and not going to flee away and will really fight for their land is not opening the eyes of the Russian propagandists about their own narratives. Let's move on. And another thing that we already discussed in one of our previous episodes is the idea that Russian propagandists are actually calling Ukraine a former country. They use a term former Ukraine, бывшая Украина. They also use the term, they try to avoid calling Ukraine Ukraine, and they're trying to say that this is a former Soviet republic. Nastya, can you elaborate on this?
Russians really prefer not to give this quality of being a political entity to Ukraine. That's why they are trying to blur the existence of Ukraine by using such names really as former Russia, former Soviet Republic, former Ukraine, former Russian lands, etc. So there are different varieties, but they are same. They are very similar in their essence. And what is important here that not mostly, but not only journalists, but also experts use such notions as former Ukraine or former Russia towards Ukraine. And it's not a new story, actually. We've traced back this story to 2015. For example, Pavel Kuzenkov, he is a Russian historian, and he is a director of Scientific and Educational Center at the Great Mediterranean. He works in Sevastopol State University. In the documentary, which is called Project Ukraine, it was shot in January 2015, he told directly exactly these words. Europe needs periphery to be prosperous. Nowadays, particularly interesting becomes the project when this periphery may include the former Russia, cheap labor force and space for economic and trade expansion. This is also a price for Euro integration. That's how propagandists wanted to denigrate Ukrainian Euro integration aspirations. They wanted to mock at Ukraine, and they didn't even say that Ukraine is a periphery or something like that. They say that it's former Russia as a periphery of the EU. In the same way, Alexei Mukhin, he is a political expert, the general director of the Center for Political Information. In his comment to the article which was published in Gazeta.ru in April 2022, he told that, in fact, Russia is decolonizing its former partner in the USSR. He was explaining why the so-called special military operation is going on. So he says that it's decolonization of former partner of the USSR, not even Ukraine. And there is also a very interesting example. These words were said by Alexander Kots, which is one of the most famous Russian military correspondents. He works for Komsomolskaya Pravda. And he was talking with his co-host, and this host asked him a question, what is our victory? And Alexander Kots answered, the parade on Krещатик, the establishment of the Russian regime in Kiev. Not a friendly, not a loyal regime, but the Russian regime. We need a governor general of Kiev who will play the role of conductor of Russian policy in the territory of the former Ukraine. That's how he called Ukraine.
Yes, to remind our listeners that Governor General is actually the terminology from the Russian Empire of the 19th century. So we see both in Putin and in his propagandists like this Alexander Kots that there is a willingness not only to restore the Soviet Union but to come back to the Russian Empire of the 19th century, to deny even the fake, the masqueraded statehood that Ukraine had in the Soviet Union, right? So it's very important, these words, that we want not only the loyal regime, not a friendly regime, but the Russian regime. And so to erase all the traces of the what they call former Ukraine. I mean, this is really very, very important. This shows how far they actually want to go. Another thing that reminds me is that this concept former, this play with the idea of former, бывший, is actually also reference to Stalin and to Stalinist idea that there are former people, бывшие люди, former human beings, those human beings that were human beings sometime in the past, but they no longer are human beings, and therefore they need to be exterminated. People like capitalists, people like bourgeois, people like maybe peasants, wealthy peasants, and etc., etc. So we see certain continuity in this propaganda as well. Another narrative is, of course, a notorious one, is an attempt to present Ukraine as a terrorist and Nazi state. Alona, what can we tell about this?
Oh, I think we should start with the idea that Ukraine is a Nazi state, because ever since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, and even before that, there were stories still circulating on the internet and media sphere that many Ukrainians were the representatives of Nazi regime. And let's remember that denazification of Ukraine was proclaimed as one of the motivations for the full-scale invasion that Russia launched on 24th of February, just almost a year ago. And it means that a Russian government considered at least that so-called Nazi settlements in Ukraine was eligible targets, and that's why they tried to justify starting the war on the territory of our sovereign foreign state. And as an example, we might use the statement that was said by Vladimir Tatarsky. He is a former mercenary millionaire journalist and blogger. That therefore the fact that Ukraine has become anti-Russian is aimed at undermining the entire Russian Federation. Therefore, the elimination of such a terrorist enclave as Ukraine has become vital for Russia. That's why it started operation on such a scale. This was mentioned on July 2022 in Donetsk Vremya and as well as on the YouTube. So we see that the previous narrative that Ukraine has become an anti-Russian project led as well can be a part of the general narrative that Ukraine is a terrorist, Nazi state, and that's why Ukraine is a threat to Russia Federation for its future development, but take into account the fact that Ukraine claim that we don't want to more be part anyhow under Russian influence. I think Russia just was afraid of the fact that this possible to lose the control over Ukraine, and Ukraine can become powerful country on the borders of Russian Federation. In some cases, Russia need to explain why they started the special military operation, why they started this war, and that's why it's necessary to explain to the society in the most simply narratives, like Russia is defending itself, so it's time to attack the country which is your direct neighbor. And I think the other one is a good example from Andrei Medvedev. He is a correspondent journalist on one of the popular propagandist channels, Russia 1. He said that Ukraine is such a collective terrorist state. Terrorists killed people simply because the essence of his existence is hatred. Ukraine is a bunch of hatred. What to do with terrorists? They are to be annihilated. There are no other options. So here is the example, like trying to compare the reasons of attacking and killing people. Russia tried to mirroring what they are doing, what kind of war crimes they committed on the territory of Ukraine, and trying to accuse Ukrainian side on what they were doing. And this is also like there were some events that was on Russian Federation. There was a round table called like Ukrainian terrorism, its roots and manifestations today. It was on November 2022, and this was like a kind of serious event that has been held by the Institute for CIS countries, trying as well to pay attention to the idea that Ukraine is the country that can be a direct threat to Russian Federation.
This is very interesting and very remarkable indeed that they hold a round table, the Institute for CIS countries. Let me remind that this is one of the Russian so-called research institutes that actually whose aim was not only to study the CIS countries, which are actually another name for former Soviet Union, the Community of Independent States, SNG in Russian, but it was also a tool to penetrate the Russian propaganda into such countries as Ukraine. And people like Zatulin and other so-called Russian experts. But the idea of calling Ukraine as a terrorist state is in itself remarkable, because we know that Ukrainians are trying to designate Russia as a terrorist state, and there were lots of resolutions done by Council of Europe, Parliamentary Assembly, done by European Parliament, calling Russia a terrorist state or the state supporting terrorism, because there are signs of it, there are evidence of this when Russia shells the civilian infrastructure, when it shells the buildings of peaceful people, when it kills the green corridors. The goal of the terrorism is to kill some number of people and to frighten everybody. This is also a tactics of Russian regime. But by which reason they are calling Ukraine a terrorist state, a state which is actually defending its territory? That's a puzzle actually. Why? What is the logic behind it? And it basically comes back to what we said in one of our previous episodes, is that these tactics of mirroring. So Ukrainians are calling justifiably Russia a terrorist state. Russians will call Ukraine a terrorist state. Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are doing genocide against Ukrainians in Ukraine. Russians will say that Ukrainians are doing genocides against Russians in Ukraine, etc., etc. So this is what is happening. Another detail, very important detail from this quote by Andrei Medvedev is that he said Ukraine is such a collective Basayev. And for you to remember, Shamil Basayev is that a person who is kind of an embodiment for the Russian regime of the Chechen terrorism. And this link between Ukraine and Chechnya, Ichkeria, is also, I think, very important for many different reasons, because basically the war in Chechnya was a preparation in many aspects to other wars. Russia is telling itself, look, we are waging a war against Chechnya to protect Russia territorial integrity, and afterwards we will invade Georgia and we will invade Ukraine, because these are our territories, these are former Russia. So the war against Ukraine is a more large-scale version of the war against Chechnya, and the tactics used in Chechnya, this horrible cruelty, this destruction of the whole cities, is actually also presented in Ukraine, also replicated in Ukraine. It was replicated in Syria with the same narratives that Russia is waging the war against terrorists, because all the opponents to the Assad regime were called terrorists, and the same with Ukraine. Why it is needed by Russian propagandists? Of course, to dehumanize. It's one of the key elements of the Russian propaganda, to dehumanize your enemy and to make killing of your enemy a morally acceptable, something you will not judge, something you will not condemn. We should keep that in mind. So calling Ukraine a terrorist state is a direct step to the genocidal propaganda. And maybe the last chapter of our conversation, all these humiliating and derogatory words that Russian propaganda is using against Ukraine. Nastya, I will ask you to make a tour around these words and to explain and to tell us what are these words that Russian propaganda is actually using.
Such words are only present in Russian propaganda, and it's possible to see them literally everywhere, in the headlines, in texts of news, people in TV shows and newscasts do not hesitate to say them. What's also interesting, they use Ukrainian words, pronouncing them in a distorted manner to show their disdain to Ukraine and to Ukrainian language, to mock at Ukraine. And when they use Ukrainian words, which really exist in Ukrainian language, they do it in such a sarcastic manner. For example, one of the most widespread words they use is nezalezhne, which translates into English like independent. They distort the pronunciation of this word, and they sarcastically say something about Ukraine when they call it nezalezhne or independent. And I can give you an example of one of the headlines on news website live.ru. It's a considerably new one. It's from 2nd March this year. And this headline says, "Scalp of nezalezhne, what the Pentagon hinted at Ukraine, demanding payment." The very similar headline was also present in Komsomolskaya Pravda.ru. It was on 5th of March this year. It says, against the backdrop of Zelensky's statements about delivering Ukraine from corruption, new scandals broke out in nezalezhne. They also use the word nenka, which is very nice word in Ukrainian language, and it means mommy, mother. But they use this word to show disdain to Ukraine, and they use it in such a humiliating manner. For example, one of the correspondents on Russian TV, Matvey Shestakov, for the program In the Center of Events with Anna Prokhorova, it's an analytical news program which is issued on the weekly basis. On 11th of November 2022, he told, in general, Nenka is now the navel of the world, such a model of the Ukrainian-centric world. And in this yellow-blue parallel universe, there are laws, orders, but most importantly, philosophy. Or, for example, one of the headlines on Vesti.ru website from it traces back to 2020. It told, from the Sumerians to Gorbachev, the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture ordered a crazy clip about the history of Nenka. So we see that they use Ukrainian words just to be sarcastic about Ukraine. One of the most widespread humiliating and derogatory words Russians use towards Ukrainians is hohols. And they use it in different variations, and they use it to call Ukraine in different ways. For example, Hoholstan or Hohlandia, or when they want to say in Ukraine, instead they can say Hohols have. For example, this notorious Sergei Mardan, whom we talked about today, in his Telegram again, he posted a comment. It was in May 2022, and he told that Hohols have a national holiday on occasion of Angelina Jolie's visit. Vladimir Solovyov, also in his Telegram channel, reposted text where this word was again used, which reads, "It is quite possible that in the eyes of the French president, Hochlandia is something like Algeria, Gabon, or Marquesas Islands." So it's so humiliating, and that's how they are trying to show disdain to Ukraine. But in fact, it's also a sign of their weakness, because they're using just offensive words to address people and other countries.
Yes, indeed. And, maybe this is a typical story of the war, that during a major conflict, the sides are trying to mock the other side's language and to avoid the decent words and to use the words which are actually presenting the other in a not decent way. Chochol, chachli is obviously a very old designation of Ukrainians by the Russians. Ukrainians also have some not very pleasant designations of Russians, of course. But it's interesting that they're really trying to use the concepts such as nezalezhne or nenka, which are actually very important for Ukraine, right? Nezalezhnost, independence, is a very important concept for Ukraine. Nenka is a very interesting and very tender word with which we actually call our mothers, but also our motherland.